Thanks. Thank you for joining us for another in the Working Class Movement Library series of Invisible Histories talks. Today we welcome Steve Illingworth to speak on the topic, The Rebellion of the Basement Lecturers, the Wandsworth Prison disturbances of 1918 to 19. A talk which will use archive material that Steve has found in our library. And as I always say, the library's events are free. However, we would like to encourage you to support us if you're able to do so. And there is a donate button on our website. Thanks, Steve. Over to you.
Right, thank you. Right, I'll just share the screen. Oops. Right, can we see the screen there? Good, thank you, good. Right, so good afternoon, everybody. As you can see from the screen there and from Lynette's introduction, this is about events in Wandsworth Prison just after the First World War. It involved very much conscientious objectors, who I know the Working Class Movement Library have got lots of material about, and you've had previous talks about that as well, including one about Fenner Brockway about 3 weeks ago, and Fenner Brockway actually was in Wandsworth for a while during World War I, so that does link into that quite nicely. Just a little bit of background about myself. First, I'm just trying to move on here, just give me a moment, please. Sorry, I'm just trying to move on to the next slide, but it doesn't seem to be working at the moment.
Do you want to come out of the come out and go back in?
Yes, I'll try. Okay.
Get out of the full screen mode and
yeah. Right, let's try again then. Yeah. Right, we've done it. Okay, thank you. Right, sorry about that. So hopefully there'll be no more hiccups now. Good. Like I was saying before, I've worked with the Working Class Movement Library quite closely in the last few years, and you can see there the sort of background. So just over 10 years ago, I was working for Salford Council as an educational advisor, previously as a secondary school history teacher. And as part of that work, I came down to the Working Class Movement Library and helped to produce some school materials. And Lynette was saying a few minutes ago that they're still actually on the website and still being used by schools as well, which is good to hear. Then from 2011 to 2015, I became a freelance advisor doing lots of different pieces of work. And one of them in 2014 to 15 was on the James Hudson project in the Working Class Movement Library. And you may recall, people who were involved at that time, this became a play, a sort of one-handed play, which was produced in the library and other venues. And also, if I remember rightly, featured on the local news at one stage as well, on the regional news. And I produced a learning pack for that. And that's really when I first got into the materials that the library has on conscientious objectors. At the moment, I occasionally come back to the library, do my own research. I'm currently looking now at conscientious objectors in World War II, which has been less written about. I'm trying to do my own study and perhaps produce something on that myself at this stage. But today's talk is about conscientious objectors in World War I, and particularly their involvement in the Wandsworth prison disturbances. The main source for the information for this talk comes from the Thomas Ellison scrapbook, which is a really wonderful piece of information and resources in the Working Class Movement Library's boxes on conscientious objectors. Thomas Ellison himself was imprisoned in Wandsworth at one stage, and his scrapbook consists of lots of newspaper cuttings, letters, one or two of his personal documents, all telling a really kind of fascinating story. And while I was working on the James Hudson project a few years ago, I came across the scrapbook, and I noticed it kept mentioning Wandsworth quite a lot, both in terms of disturbances going on there, in terms of things like questions in Parliament, etc. And I thought at some stage it would be useful to go back and have a look at it in more detail at what was actually happening there. One thing led to another, and to cut a long story short, I ended up writing this up as an article, which came out about a year ago, in the well-known magazine, the Prison Service Journal. Now, I'm sure when I finish this talk, you'll be dashing down to your local newsagent to try and find if they still have a copy of this. If they don't worry, because you can simply type Prison Service Journal 249 into Google or any other search engine, and it will come up with the whole edition, free to read. You don't have to register or anything like that. And you can see the whole of my article and some other articles as well in there. So if you want to know a bit more about the events I'm going to describe today in a little bit more detail, feel free to look at that later. So what the article is about and what this talk is about is what's on the bottom bullet point there. So it's the nature of a Wandsworth disturbances, the causes of them, and the consequences of them, both kind of short-term and long-term. So going back to the nature of the disturbances, and so what we get in 1916 is a new crime. I suppose technically speaking, conscientious objection was not a crime because you could legally register as a conscientious objector. However, what became a crime fairly quickly was people who refused any compromise alternatives, such as joining the non-combatant corps or doing other kind of work of national importance. And these people became known as the absolutists. So generally speaking, men between the ages of 18 and 45 who were forcibly conscripted to the armed forces, in 1916. If they completely refused to do that or any other alternatives offered, then they would have to, eventually they would end up find themselves in prison. They'd be fined first of all, but of course they would then refuse to pay the fines, and eventually they would be imprisoned. There was a limit on the length of their imprisonment. It seemed to vary. Sometimes it was 3 months, sometimes 6 months. And at the end of that, they would be released. But then the process would start all over again. They would then be called up to the army or the armed forces again. They would refuse to obey orders. Typically, this would be their first instruction would be to change out of their civilian clothes into army uniform, for example. They'd refuse to do that. They'd be given several chances to do it. Then they'd be court-martialed, found guilty, imprisoned, and it starts all over again. So some people found that they probably had spent at least 2 or 3 years actually in prison, pretty much most of the time, between, let's say, March 1916, when the law actually kicks in, through to well into 1919, as we'll see. And indeed, in 1919, this is still going on. Of course, the war, as we know, ends in November 1918. But it's only really by August 1919 that the final conscientious objectors are released from prison. And the reason for this delay was obviously after November 1918, the army was no longer recruiting people, and yet the conscientious objectors were not released. And the Home Secretary at the time, a man called Edward Short, explained this to Parliament in February 1919, as you can see there. Basically saying in that sentence that he was not going to release conscientious objectors while there were serving soldiers who had not been discharged themselves, because he didn't think the public would like that. He talks about a very big feeling that would be aroused. So it was really, I suppose you could say, for political reasons or certainly propaganda reasons, that the conscientious objectors were kept in prison well beyond the end of World War I. And as we'll see, that partly relates to the Wandsworth disturbances, because they do start right at the end of the war and carry on after the war. So the actual nature of the disturbances, and this is what makes them quite unique and unusual in some ways. First of all, the prisoners' demands. The main thing they were actually asking for was to have more time to talk to each other and more time to write letters to each other. So these, as I say, mainly conscientious objectors, 1 or 2 kind of people who self-identified as anarchists as well in there. But they weren't, demanding better food or better bedding or better conditions in any other way. They weren't even demanding to be released. They just wanted to be able to talk to each other and write letters. In the Thomas Ellison scrapbook in the library, you do actually find one of his letters, and you can see how it's a very kind of formulaic standard approach. It's pretty much a template, and all you fill in is your own name. And generally speaking, you're allowed to say whether you're feeling good or very good or something like that, and that's it basically. And you're only allowed to send one of those to your family about once every 3 months. So it was very restrictive in that respect. And for people like the conscientious objectors, as we'll see, who very often came from professional backgrounds such as teachers, social workers, and they found this particularly difficult because they like to talk, they like to write, they like to read, and all these things were being restricted for them in prison. So the first sign of the disturbances was back in the early autumn of 1918. The war still going on at this time, when they went on a work strike. Now, the conscientious objectors in prison were often sentenced to hard labour. They weren't just allowed to sit in their cells, they had to do some kind of hard work as well. And they refused to do that, or many of them did anyway. And their punishment for refusing to do that was then to be put in isolation cells, where they couldn't have contact with any other prisoners. This carried on for a few weeks, and then some of the COs then decided to go on a hunger strike as well. You'll know that the suffragettes, just 10 years or so before, had a similar kind of tactic as well, a hunger strike while in prison. And very often, you may probably be well aware of what was called the Cat and Mouse Act in suffragette times, where basically the prisoners they got very, very ill, were released by the authorities to prevent them dying and having sort of martyrs on their hands. And then when they were well enough again, brought back into prison. And a similar situation applied to the conscientious objectors too. Then, when they were in isolation, many of the conscientious objector prisoners smashed the glass in the spy holes used by the prison warders, and they broke the ventilation shafts, which were used because they had gas lights down there, were used to kind of circulate and ventilate the gas. This wasn't just random vandalism. This was so that they could then have a way of communicating to each other. They could then shout down through the ventilation shafts and make contact with the person in the next cell and in other cells as well. And once they'd done that, this then led to the last two activities mentioned down there: lectures and songs. Keep the red flag flying was a popular favourite, and other, kind of what you might call left-wing songs were being sung at the time. We'll come on to the lectures in a moment, but basically, when we talk about a lecture here, we mustn't imagine that there's a special kind of communal hall in the prison where all the prisoners file into and listen to somebody talk from the front. This is somebody usually with their chin on a ventilation shaft hole, shouting through the hole so that the other prisoners could hear him. Okay, this is the nature of the lectures. The chief lecturer was Guy Aldred, fairly well known as a kind of socialist and anarchist. He was actually born in London, but lived most of his life in Glasgow, so probably was brought up with a Scottish accent, etc. And he was one who seemed to revel in this situation and really enjoyed, giving the lectures to the rest of the to his fellow conscientious objectors. Now, this might look like a slight diversion here, but this is still relevant to what we're talking about. Some of you may be familiar with the BBC Two quiz, a very highbrow quiz, Only Connect, where contestants have to try and find the link often between 4 different random things. And very often they have a picture around as well. So you can see here a picture of suffragettes. You can see a picture of Elizabeth Gaskell's book, Karl Marx, and Jesus Christ. Now, this would be a very, very hard Only Connect question, even by the standards of Only Connect. Basically, what these were the titles of the four main lectures given by Guy Aldred. So the top left one, he talked about women's freedom, was the title of one of his lecture. bear in mind that this will be a male-only audience in Wandsworth Prison at the time. The top right one, the actual title here was The Revolutionary Tradition in English Literature. That was Aldred's title. Now, I've taken a slight liberty there because I think you probably argue that Elizabeth Gaskell was more a reformer than a revolutionary, but you get the kind of idea if you'll allow me some license on that one. And then another talk on Karl Marx and another talk on Jesus Christ, I think particularly on perhaps the potential socialist aspects of some of Christ's teachings there. So there were the lectures that you'd be treated to by Guy Aldred, if you found yourself isolated in the solitary confinement cells of Wandsworth Prison. And this was a way of the prisoners just trying to perhaps keep their spirits going in these difficult times. I get the impression that all the prisoners supported these disturbances. And what's really interesting is how, as you probably expect with conscientious objectors, they are very independent-minded to a large extent. They have their own way of doing things. And so you have this situation here. This was reported in the Spur journal at the time. So like it says here, you've got 14 prisoners who went on hunger strike. 5 others who went on hunger strike but hadn't been previously work striking, then 8 prisoners who did the work strike but not the hunger strike. So the whole thing becomes a very kind of complicated Venn diagram in the end in terms of who's doing what. But basically, my studies of conscientious objectors reveal that if you have 20 of them in a room, you're likely to have 21 different opinions, basically, and all very individualized, all very idiosyncratic in their particular views. So what you actually had here is a situation where this even amongst the COs, the agitation in the prison was not universally accepted or had universal involvement. So Guy Aldred, who actually led the revolt, admits in his book that only about 1/3 of the COs were actually involved in this. Leonard Sims, another prisoner not involved, he referred to Aldred and the others as the basement oligarchy. He was almost kind of suggesting there was a bit of an elite in-crowd amongst the prisoners who were involved in all this agitation, and he, for one, didn't actually want to be involved in it. The title of this talk, of course, is The Basement Lecturers, and that sort of comes partly from that quotation there. And there were actually complaints to the governors. Ironically, this was one of the aims of the original labour strike, if you like, the refusal to do the hard labour, was to try and get more books for the prisoners to read. That was partially successful, but then the supreme irony was then that many of the prisoners found that there's so much noise being made by the basement lecturers with their singing and their lecturing that they couldn't concentrate on their reading. Okay, so you can't please everybody all the time, can you? Really, so it's one of those kind of bizarre situations. But certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that all the prisoners, or even all the conscientious objector prisoners, were involved. There were mixed feelings down there, as it were. So that's the nature of the disturbances. Interesting to look at actually what caused the disturbances to happen in Wandsworth, because you do get minor disturbances elsewhere, but Wandsworth was the one where these things seem to be happening more. When you look at the dates and you think this is going on mainly in the months after the First World War has finished, you will probably jump to the conclusion that perhaps the reason for this was they wanted to be released. They wanted to go home. The war was over. However, in September 1918, 2 months before the war ended, and I think we probably would say that in November 1918, the war ended fairly suddenly and unexpectedly. I don't think anybody in September 1918 could have predicted that. So it was a situation, where there was other reasons apart from wanting to be released. It could be maybe that conditions in Wandsworth were worse than those elsewhere, but I've looked into this in some detail and the evidence suggests not. There was a report called English Prisons Today, published just after the First World War, partly by our friend Fenner Brockway, who we had to talk about a few weeks ago, and also Stephen Hobhouse, another agitator at the time. They were both imprisoned in Wandsworth and elsewhere, And at the end of that, they took the chance to then produce their report on the English prison system. But basically, they were more concerned about some of the smaller prisons. Wandsworth was a large prison, and they actually felt in the larger prisons like Wandsworth, conditions weren't too bad, relatively speaking. And it could be partly that the agitators in Wandsworth were provoked partly by governmental tactics. So the cat and mouse act, being released from prison and made to go back in again. And certainly one MP there, as you can see, reckoned that the government's treatment was turning many honest Christian men into rebels, people who'd gone in there just, through a kind of pure conscience reasons, probably very peace-loving, mild men, being turned into, people really agitating strongly, because of the government treatment was the argument there. When I looked into this in detail, I thought that possibly the main reason was, and you've got to be careful here not to have modern ideas being kind of extrapolated back into the past, but in terms of men's own mental health and well-being. Now, obviously, mental health and well-being would not have been phrases used back then. It's only really in the last 10, 15 years, I think, that most of us have started to hear those phrases now. But lots of evidence of people visiting Wandsworth and other prisons and being really concerned about the mental state of the prisoners being kept there, particularly those in isolation. So we've got in the Christian World, and all these quotations, by the way, can be found in the Thomas Ellison scrapbook in the library. So we've got the nerve-wracking, soul-destroying torture mentioned, these lonely men, nervous wreck, mental breakdown. So this, to me, subconsciously, this is what really spurred the conscientious objectors in Wandsworth Prison on, because they wanted that sense of camaraderie, that sense of sociability. Otherwise, they might literally have gone mad. And so I think this was what made them get involved in these activities, these loud sing-songs and in defiance of the silent system, etc. John Bailey, who has been a prisoner in Wandsworth but was released by January 1919, he backs this up really when he talks about the comradeship that he felt in Wandsworth amongst the work and discipline strikers, those taking the strike against the hard labour. Talks about a very real and deep sense of comradeship there, and he looks back and he says, I know they're having a strike now, and he will stand by them in the strike to the last ounce of fight that is in me. So I think again that sort of shows that the communal spirit engendered by the striking and the singing and the lecturing, the defiance of the silent isolation, was something which really did the men a lot of good in terms of their mental health. So that's the causes. Looking at the consequences, and I've divided these into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Not because that's the kind of thing when we're teaching this in schools, but I think it kind of makes sense in this sort of context. The immediate reaction of the government was actually very repressive. They sent in a man called Blake, Governor Blake, and as you can see there, when he arrives in February 1919, all this agitation is at its height, really. But as you can see, it's really, he really kind of fans the flames in quite an unpleasant way. It's fairly clear that Blake has been appointed because he despises conscientious objectors, and the authorities decide, here's somebody who will stand no nonsense and sort them out. The first incident mentioned, he raised a prisoner called Harris, was actually before Blake had started his official duties. He was being shown round to the prison that he was about to take over, and while walking round there, he comes across Harris, starts, a fairly unprovoked kind of shouting match at him, and Harris, rather sarcastically, I think, then thanks him for his trouble, which then leads Blake into what's called a mad frenzy. Okay, so this eyewitness account of this confrontation. When Blake actually started his duties, things didn't get any better. And on one occasion, there's actually lots of examples of this, but on one occasion, he parades 50 conscientious objectors round the prison and comes out with the incredible statement. He wants them paraded round away from the rest of the prisoners, because I will not have these stinking COs mixed up with respectable men. Respectable men like murderers, armed robbers, I presume. But clearly in Blake's eyes, conscientious objection was a step beyond murder in terms of how bad the crime was. So Blake goes in and makes things worse, basically. But by April 1919, he's been dismissed, and there's actually an inquiry into his time there as well. So, clearly we mustn't kind of see the authorities almost like united here in their condemnation and in their repression of the conscientious objectors. Even for, the government at the time, this was going too far. Winston Churchill, who went on to even greater things later, is actually the person who steps in here and probably might be surprising in some ways, and actually calms things down. I know certainly in recent years, particularly for people of a left centre persuasion, it's become quite fashionable to challenge lots of Churchill's ideas on imperialism, attitude towards the working class, etc. But on this occasion, he seems to have actually observed carefully what was going on, taken sort of sound advice, and so by April 1919, he'd come to this kind of pragmatic view, really, that there was nothing much to be gained by keeping the COs in prison. It was going to be a lot of hard work. The government was probably going to lose this particular propaganda battle in the end. So gradually, they started to release them. First of all, those who'd already served 2 years in prison. And bear in mind that the earliest you could probably have gone to prison would have been March 1916. So if you've been from March 1916 to April 1919, 3 years basically. So lots of COs had actually been in prison for at least 2 of those 3 years. And then by August 1919, all COs were released, whatever length of time they'd served in prison. So, and we'll see later how Churchill retains this kind of view into the Second World War as well. First, though, some of the long-term consequences of these disturbances. I mentioned before how Stephen Hobhouse and Fenner Brockway produced a book called English Prisons Today, which came out in about 1920, 1921, I think. And this was fairly well received in governmental circles, but for various kind of political reasons, it took them a while to implement some of its findings, but they did. If you look at the dates then, and throughout the 1920s, as you probably know, it was quite a sort of up and down time politically. It starts with a kind of conservative liberal coalition under Lloyd George, and then you go to a conservative government, a Labour government, another conservative government, and another Labour government. So I think that's partly it, that government started in legislation and then basically ran out of time when they were then voted out and the next lot came in. But I think you'll see that both Conservative and Labour governments are actually passing these laws. I think it's sort of fair to say here. And what you can see here is a lot of the things really that the Wandsworth agitators had been complaining about gradually became abolished in terms of prison conditions. So first of all, from 1922, they were actually allowed to talk to each other while they were doing their work. Not all the time, but at certain times in the day, more talking was allowed. 1924, solitary confinement abolished for most prisoners. That was basically for all those, apart from those sentenced to hard labour. For them, it continued until 1931. But even then, it was abolished for everybody. 1926, the silence rule was abolished completely. So the idea that you had to be silent, no longer the case. Books were allowed more freely into prisons. That had been sort of a bit hit and miss before. Regular lectures and concerts in some prisons. Again, going back to the Wandsworth people, this idea had caught on. And this time, it would be, you wouldn't be shouting down a gas ventilation shaft. This time you would actually have a proper hall to be able to do it in. And then by the mid-1920s, you've got reports of the Prison Commission coming out, and they're starting to talk here about, treating prisoners like real human beings. There's a change in tone of the whole thing. And again, I think this comes from the kind of demands that the Wandsworth prisoners were making, and then being able to articulate, once they'd actually left prison as well. And just to show that this actually was happening, the rather reactionary Governor Rich, the previous person mentioned was Blake, but another Blake type character, Rich here, in his memoirs, looked back to his time in Wandsworth in the 1920s and complains about these classes, visitors, concerts, lectures, etc. So all these kind of things that he wouldn't agree with, clearly they were happening in Wandsworth because they are there for him to complain about. So as we can see, by the early 1930s, prison conditions are really starting to change, particularly in terms of the mental health issues, like the solitary confinement, being able to read, being able to talk to each other, lack of isolation, etc. And so I think the Wandsworth prison agitations does actually have some impact on this. Looking ahead further to World War II, both the Conservative and coalition prime ministers of World War II, Chamberlain and Churchill, both taking a more kind of liberal attitude towards conscientious objectors than had been seen in World War I. So Chamberlain, obviously prime minister at the start of World War II, when conscription was introduced, this time right at the start of the war in 1939. And this time, as you can see from what Chamberlain's saying here, he had sat on tribunals who were testing conscientious objectors in World War I. And he said that he'd learnt a lot from that particular situation. And he says it was an exasperating waste of time and effort to attempt such people to act in a manner that was contrary to their principles. So in other words, Chamberlain is saying it wasn't worth the government, trying to pursue conscientious objectors to the point of putting them in prison. Now that did happen in World War II. Many conscientious objectors did still go to prison, but far fewer than in World War I. There were far more alternatives for them, and a genuine conscientious objection could get you out of everything in World War II, whereas it couldn't necessarily in World War I. So basically, the rules were relaxed there. And likewise, when Churchill took over from Chamberlain in 1940, he too had learned from his experience of being Minister of War back in 1919, where he had seen what had happened when you tried to, just kind of take on the conscientious objectors and try to minimise their freedom. So again, his attitude was to be far more humane. One thing in my current studies of World War II conscientious objection, I have found that locally there was still quite a lot of prejudice from local councils and local people in the streets against the conscientious objectors. Most local councils actually took action against employees who were conscientious objectors, either sacking them or cutting their wages or whatever it might be. However, at national level, people like Chamberlain and Churchill had a different view. There were actually many senior civil servants working for the government in the war who were conscientious objectors but were allowed to keep their jobs. So as I say, you do get a slightly more liberal view at the top, but not necessarily at the sort of local council level in World War II. But certainly for Chamberlain and Churchill, the experience of witnessing things like the Wandsworth disturbances of 1919 did have an impact on their future thinking. I'm going to conclude with what was a few lines from the conclusion of the article that I read, and you can see that down at the bottom again if you want to make a note of that. So as I say, if you simply type Prison Service Journal 249 into Google, you'll find this fairly easily. So there's no cost to pay, don't even have to register, it's just there freely for the public to see. And I'm not going to read all this out, but you can see here that this kind of sums up in some ways the main causes and consequences of the disturbances at Wandsworth. So first of all, like I've said, that the Wandsworth prisoners undertook those kind of disturbances largely because the alternative would have been too much for them. And like I said, there would have been too much for their minds and hearts to bear. So just having some companionship, having some kind of sense of purpose, you know, even if it was just like a daily lecture of some kind or a good sing-song at 8 o'clock in the evening or whatever, it gave them something to keep their minds off the terrible situation that they were facing in the prisons. And then I've suggested there that you know, there were quite significant long-term developments and of the Wandsworth disturbances, particularly when they were articulated in the English Prisons Today report, you know, done by Hobhouse and Brockway, and that they did remove, you know, some of the things that the Wandsworth Prison had challenged, some of the such as solitary confinement, etc. They were removed from a British prison system forever. So I would say that, you know, the Wandsworth Prison disturbances, a very interesting story in their own right, in terms of the uniqueness really of the kind of protest and the very kind of almost like very intellectual style of prison protest, but not an isolated event in terms of its sort of long-term future consequences. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. That's that definitely fits the bill of our overarching title of Invisible Histories, doesn't it? That's an extraordinary hidden story there. That's terrific. And I think for those of you who are often here, the companionship of our Zoom talks has been great over this last more than a year now. And I'm very glad we're not having to shout down ventilation shafts because that would have been much more complicated, wouldn't it? And we can see people from a bit further than it would have to have been a long ventilation shaft to see some of you, wouldn't it? Folks, be thinking of questions. We've got one here from Helen. To what extent did the COs continue to agitate for prison reform after being released?
Yes. I would say that partly that was kind of mentioned in the talk, in the sense that you had people like Fenner Brockway and Stephen Hobhouse, who both had been imprisoned. Certainly Brockway, I'm not sure about Hobhouse, but Brockway had spent some time in Wandsworth anyway. And when they were released, they decided that probably, although you'd had the suffragettes who'd been imprisoned 10 years before, apart from them, many of the suffragettes being, you know, kind of educated middle class. Apart from that, these were probably some of the first men from professional and intellectual backgrounds who would have actually seen the inside of a prison. So they thought it was almost their duty to then articulate their experiences for the greater good of a prison system. So that's where you do get this agitation for reform and the writing of the very influential English Prisons Today book. And I think it's an interesting, I think probably often with human nature, it's a kind of situation where when you're actually faced with that kind of difficulty on the spot, when you're actually in the prison, you'll be thinking to yourself, when I get out of here, you know, things are going to change. I'm going to tell the world about this. But sometimes you'll be so relieved in some ways that when you are out of that situation, and maybe then so absorbed with other sort of issues out in civilian life, that maybe some of that frenzy and enthusiasm to actually change things might diminish slightly. However, you know, in the case of Hobhouse and Brockway, that was not the case. They did go on to agitate for prison reform through their book and through other campaigns as well.
Thanks. Ken asks, have you come across any COs who weren't left-wing?
Yes, certainly amongst the Wandsworth prisoners, the most vocal of them were left-wing. So I mentioned about the singing of the singing of a red flag, for example, and certainly because the Russian Revolution had just happened a couple of years before as well. And certainly by that stage, that was generally seen by most of these people as a good thing. And some of the, you know, concerns that people might have had about the revolution only perhaps emerged later. So certainly amongst this group of prisoners, they were mainly left-wing. However, I suspect that some of the dissenting voices I mentioned, the ones who complained about the noise and complained about the basement oligarchy, I don't know for certain, but I guess it's possible that they may not have shared some of those particular views. They would have been against war, but they but maybe their politics, might have been slightly different there. I mean, certainly in World War One, conscientious objection is often tied up with a kind of socialist, anti-imperialist kind of concept as well. The idea that all wars are fought between empires just for their own self-aggrandizement, etc. I think by World War II, you do get to slightly different sort of point of view. If you don't mind me sort of jump into that particular conflict to discuss this. Of course, in World War II, the country is then fighting against a very right-wing regime, or right-wing regimes, if you include Italy as well. And this time, some of the conscientious objectors in World War II have to justify their actions in ways that make them sound slightly more right-wing. So, for example, if you're in World War II and you say we are not going to fight, by definition, particularly in 1940, 1941, you are implying that Britain might, if it doesn't fight, may well be defeated, may well be taken over by the Nazis. And in some ways then, you do have people saying, in Peace News, for example, the Peace Pledge Union's paper, you do have them saying things like, well, maybe Hitler's not that bad. And obviously with hindsight, this sounds a sort of dreadful thing, but there is lots of evidence of that kind of thing appearing in Peace News in the Second World War, not because of actual admiration for Hitler, but almost as a kind of grudging acceptance that one thing worse than Hitler is the devastation and destruction of World War II. So by World War II, it's a slightly different way of things. World War I, mainly, the conscientious objectors do seem to be left of centre.
We'll have you back to talk to us about World War II, definitely.
That's right. Yeah, give me another year to finish my studies on that, and I'll let you know. Yeah,
excellent. So Kat asks, were there any links you found between COs in World War I and the suffragettes who'd experienced this too? Any sharing of knowledge or support, etc.?
Not explicitly, but you're quite right. I mean, the experiences were very similar in terms of being very, not always, but very often educated, perhaps slightly more middle class professional people in both cases, actually going inside prison for the first time. Both having to suffer from the kind of cat and mouse type tactics of of hunger strikes, and then being released and then arrested again. There were a group of women who regularly used to come to the outside of Wandsworth Prison, and they would sing their own songs of motivation, hoping. Well, I think the men did hear them. We know that from later records. The men would then hear their voices in the distance, and that would be something which would boost their morale. And I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think some of those had been suffragettes at one particular point as well.
I'm interested. I'm so fascinated by the idea of shouting down the ventilation shaft. Alongside the Guy Aldred ones, are there other ones that we know about? What this sort of range of topics?
I think so. I'm not quite sure about any other topics, but there were certainly on those, kind of generally speaking, left-wing themes, I suppose, that we mentioned before. Yes, the idea. Guy Aldred was a main lecturer. Just because obviously resting your chin on a ventilation shaft for so long was very arduous. So the songs were to give him a rest, basically. So he would give one lecture, then he'd have a sort of 10-minute break while he stroked his chin and made it better, perhaps. And then people would sing the songs, and then we'd go back to the lecture. I'm fairly sure that there were other lecturers, but he's the one who's mentioned the most anyway.
All right. Gosh, there's a play in this, really, isn't there? I think it sort of feels almost unbelievable. So, but yeah. And I take the point. I mean, there's a sort of Monty Python element to it, but actually, as you say, the mental health aspect and the emotional support aspect really, really important. Folks, has anybody got many current resonances, as Helen says? Yes, thank you, Helen. Has anybody got any other points or queries they would like to make? while you are thinking whether you want to wave at me, I will just say that great, I'll come to you in a second, Helen. The Ellison scrapbook is a wonderful thing, as Steve has mentioned. I mentioned in the chat that you can have a bit more information about it if you just type Ellison into the search box on our website, because it featured as our object of the month to mark the centenary of the end of the war, so November 2018. Yeah, there's all sorts of things. It has been used by our volunteer Chris, has made a lot of use of it, thinking about COs. But it's extraordinary that just those little scraps of paper and letters, etc., that were kept, sort of tell so many stories and have so many resonances. It's brilliant. So if you're able to come to the library, we would love to see you, and you're welcome to have a browse through that scrapbook. Helen, yes, we'd like to unmute.
More connected with World War II, and I hadn't thought a great deal about conscientious objectors in World War II. Was it reasonably common for people who'd signed the Peace Pledge Union in the 30s to then find a way, perhaps to join the ambulance corps or something like that? Was that a common way to handle it?
Yeah, there were lots of routes actually from many. I think it was about 100,000 people or so signed the Peace Pledge in the 1930s. Yes, some of those retained, if you like, their kind of absolutism and decided that they didn't want anything to do with the war whatsoever, and even joining the Friends Ambulance Service, for example, would be, or Friends Ambulance Unit, FAU, wasn't it? Even joining that unit, they felt was almost like supporting the war too much, and so there was quite a big debate there amongst conscientious objectors. Some did, many did, and I think you do find many more pacifists, let's call them in general, in World War II, helping out with humanitarian type work than you did in World War I. And I think one of the main reasons for that is the obvious one, that the war was brought right to their street, wasn't it? You know, in World War I, the war was happening over there, over the channel to a large extent. But yes, there was some bombing of London and the East Coast, but generally speaking, it was elsewhere. In World War II, of course, most of the country is suffering from bombing and the effects of the Blitz. That did, I think, compel quite a few people to say, well, I can still object to the war, but I'm going to do my bit to man or woman an ambulance, if you like, and help out in that way. There were also a lot of people who had signed the Peace Pledge who decided gradually at various points in the late 1930s into the early 1940s to abandon their pacifism and support the war, often quite actively. That starts with the Spanish Civil War. So particularly many of the kind of socialists then feel that fighting fascism is more important than their pacifism. And so that starts then. Others recant of their pacifism in the really, the dark days of 1940, 1941, when it looks like Britain's about to be invaded, there's bombing happening every night, there's a real possibility of defeat. And at that stage, some people say, well, enough is enough, and the idea of Europe being taken over by the Nazis is a worse evil than war itself. And so that does happen as well. I mean, one thing I've been particularly interested in is those in the Second World War who were staunch pacifists in the 1930s, and then in the 1940s, become staunch supporters of the war, and yet retain some of their kind of pacifist style principles. One example of that is Ellen Wilkinson, for example, who was the only female cabinet minister during World War II. And she is, right up to 1937, she is an adamant, ardent pacifist, had been in World War I, but then joins the government, but then after the Second World War is involved in quite a few what you might call pacifist type endeavours. So those principles still remain. And I think that could be a whole other talk, which I can perhaps book myself in for in a couple of years' time, which would be about the former pacifists and how they change their mind in the early 1940s, but don't completely change their principles. But that's for another story, perhaps.
Yeah, obviously. Consider yourself booked, Steve.
Right,
yes.
thank you. I'll make a note in my diary for June June 2023, let's say.
Yeah. Sheila mentions that in Oldham, many of the COs claimed exemption on religious grounds. Is that something you've researched, Sheila? You want to unmute yourself?
Yes, during the commemorative war years, Dorothy Bintley and I volunteered with Oldham Archives, and we did a joint project on the conscientious objectors in our area, and many were on religious grounds.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's probably true to say, actually, that those who objected on religious grounds were probably more numerous than those who objected on political grounds. It's possible that my talk today has been skewed more towards the political, because that was the nature of some of the leaders of the Wandsworth disturbances. Yeah. But yes, you're quite right to kind of correct that slight bias there. And I think both in World War I and in World War II, the main objection, would have been on religious grounds, whether it was Quakers, Jehovah's Witnesses, or other, or Christian denominations apart from the Quakers, and that was very common. And often, particularly in World War II, the tribunals looked more favourably upon those who seemed to have a genuine religious reason rather than those who had a political reason. That seemed to go down better. And in many cases, if you more or less turned up to a tribunal and could prove that you were a Quaker, you were often, certainly in World War II, went just way through. That was kind of accepted by World War II, that Quakerism equated with pacifism. So yes, you're quite right. Religious grounds were the most common.
No, just add, we're actually extremely lucky in Oldham because our local paper recorded all the tribunals with names and reasons that were given by conscientious objectors. So we're very fortunate in that respect. Yes,
good. Yes. I began my teaching career in Oldham actually many years ago. And I wish I'd known that then. That would have been really useful. Yes. So, yes.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Sheila. Okay, I think we're drawing towards a close. Is anybody wanting to wave at me to ask anything? Okay, I think we are. Yeah, we're getting a bit of applause here, Steve. Thank you very much. It's been great to hear about this really unusual invisible history, and yeah, we look forward to you coming back and telling us some more. Thanks everybody for your contributions as always. So now next week, it's Wednesday the 9th of June, but it's the later time of 4 p.m. We're very pleased to be participating in the first Greater Manchester Festival of Libraries. And I'll be presenting live, I hope, from the Portico Library's beautiful Georgian reading room. And the reason why it's 4 o'clock is that their reading room is open till 4, and so we have to wait until they're closed. So hopefully you'll be able to join us 4 p.m. next Wednesday, and you'll have the chance to find out what happened when staff from the two institutions swapped places and got a chance to dig around and find connections between these two very different libraries. A reminder that this talk has been recorded today and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll be putting the link on the event webpage. Also a reminder that our talks are as usual free. However, we do encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. Thanks so much to those of you who have done and continue to do that. We do appreciate it. And there's a donate button on our website. Thanks again, and goodbye until almost the same time next week, 4 p.m. next week. Take care. In solidarity, very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.